I would like to start by thanking all the people who made it possible for me to be here, and also to thank the committee. You know, these things just don't happen. A lot of people do a lot of hard work. How about an extra hand for the committee? I also want to thank Guy, who was my contact, Joe, who picked me up at the airport last night, even though it was raining straight down, the planes were late. I want to thank Gordon for feeding me today, and I want to thank Barry and the people that have made it so much easier for me. Thank you very much, all of you. I come from a little town called Nocona, Texas, and I can tell by the look in your eye it's not a household word. It's 30,000 souls, 100 miles north of Dallas, and we've had some weather similar to what you're having in the Bay Area now. The high sustained winds, you know, and the result was when we finally surveyed what had happened due to all this, we had done over $30,000 worth of improvements. We're going to have a happy time tonight. You know, these are happy programs. My name is Bob S., and I'm an enthusiastic member of Al-Anon. I think I got here like most Al-Anons, a loving alcoholic. My wife, Betty, who died 4 years ago at the time of her death, was 19 years sober in the AA program, and I was just a month behind her in the Al-Anon. So you see, the beauty of it is that the program was there and available when we needed it so badly in 1979. Some people had carried it on so that it was available for us just like it's available for you. You know, it's not what we add to the temple past, but how well we keep it green and viable that counts. I noticed that some of your workshops are on service, and I want to tell you a little bit. I'd like to tell you that I jumped right into service, but that's not the way it happened. My sponsor goaded me into it. I've been the GR. I served 3 years for the West Texas Assembly, and a few years ago I got a call from our central office asking me if I consider myself to be a candidate for trustee at large for all of Al-Anon. And I seem to have the educational qualifications for which they searched and the business experience, so I called them back and said, yeah. I'd prayed and talked about it in my group, and I said, yeah, I'm putting a name down. I'd love to be a candidate for trustee at large for all of Al-Anon. And guess what? I didn't get it. Oh, don't we hate rejection? Of course, my first thought was, if they didn't want me, why did they bother me? But then my program came to my rescue like it always would and said, hey, whoever got that job was much better capable of doing what they needed at the time, was the person for the job, and maybe our Heavenly Father has something else for me to do. And I'm totally free of that. And that's one of the beauties of our program. It frees us of that kind of thinking. Although I've only been a member of Al-Anon 23 years, I am somewhat of an anachronism. I'm the only person still living that was present when Alcoholics Anonymous founded. Mothers met for the first time Mother's Day, Akron, Ohio, 1935. My dad's Dr. Bob and my mom's Ann, and I rode out with my parents to meet with Bill for the very first time. And now I'm the only one left. Last February, my beloved sister Sue died. So they're all gone except me. It's kind of a scary position to be in, you know, the last one standing. But to show you I'm not completely well, the thought has dawned on me. Nobody can say, now, Bob, that's not the way it happened. I want to talk to you tonight, take you back with me in my memory of those times, if I may, because this is the time and place that Alcoholics Anonymous was first started. My dad had come home the day before Mother's Day with a potted plant and set it down. He was potted. Went upstairs and passed out. My mom was a friend of Henrietta Cyberling's, and Henrietta called and said, "Ann, there's a man out here that thinks he can help out. Bring him right on out." Well, Mom had to explain to Henrietta that Bob was in no shape to talk to anybody, but she said, "I'll get him out there tomorrow." Well, as we rode along, he said he had one of the worst hangovers he ever had. And he said, 15 minutes of this bird is all I want. But folks, it wasn't 15 minutes. He and Bill went off in a room by themselves and they talked many hours. And as a result of that meeting, and at my mom's invitation, Bill came and he lived at our home all that summer. And this is the time that Alcoholics Anonymous ideas were formulated and put together. It was in the middle of the last Great Depression when we lived in a one industry town, Akron, Ohio. They made tires. Goodyear, Goodrich, General, Firestone, Cyberling, Miller, all the rubber factories were there in Akron. Well, when the Depression hit, people stopped buying automobiles and they sure didn't need tires. So the rubber shops went down to 2 days a week if anybody had a job. And there were strong men on the street corner selling apples for 5 cents a piece. That's how tough times were. And we would have been thrown out of our house if it hadn't been for the mortgage moratorium declared by President Roosevelt in 1933, whereby people who, like us, who could no longer make the mortgage payments were allowed to stay in the house. So that's the way things were in our home. My mom didn't say to Bill, I think these programs are a series of nudging miracles. Can you imagine what it's like in my eyes, knowing it started with 2 guys that couldn't have raised $50 between them, to what it is now all over the world? I just saw the big book published in Chinese for the first time. So AA is now starting into China. But anyway, these miracles slowly happen, and I can think of lots of them. But let me talk to you about some. Bill, my mom didn't say to Bill, "Why don't you come over and have lunch next Tuesday?" She said, "Bill, come live with us. Maybe you two can work out something." I think Bill was a stranger. That's kind of a miracle, isn't it? Now remember, Bill lived in New York City and we lived in Akron, Ohio, and I tell you another miracle, Bill said okay. As near as I could tell, these two fellows had 2 things going for them. They both had open spiritual minds and they had the desire to be of service to another human being. Those were the 2 things. They had no money. And I think that's important. AA started from absolutely nothing. And the reason I mention that, there may be some of you here, and that's right where you are with your life right now. You're starting over, you're coming back, or whatever, or you're starting in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and you think that right now your life, you're starting from nothing. And another thing, I think that these programs are miracles, as I mentioned, and there may be some of you here that are starting from nothing that are in bad need of a miracle. And I want to talk to you about that. So I want to talk about starting from nothing. I want to talk about miracles. And I want to talk about recovery. I love to hear people talk about recovery. What worked, what didn't work. I'm not going into what it used to be like very much. I think everyone here already knows how to be miserable. Okay. They decided that the first thing they needed to do was find another alcoholic, and the first one they found was a young guy by the name of Eddie R. And Eddie had been just thrown out of his house for non-payment of rent, along with a cute little blonde wife and 2 stair-step kids. So they moved the whole family into our home, took Eddie upstairs and locked him in the upstairs where he'd be available as they got this knowledge. Hey, you got to remember, nothing's written. They're just trying to stay a page ahead of Eddie. But Eddie was an agile young guy, and we had downspouts, and Eddie would open the second story with it, slide down the downspouts, and escape. And they'd have to recapture Eddie to continue his recovery. One time Eddie got as far away as Cleveland, Ohio, 35 miles. Called him up on the phone, collect, to let them know that he was going to commit suicide. But that he would give them time to drive up and witness the event. Well, they gathered Eddie up one more time, brought him home, and when Eddie sobered up, he had some mental problems that hadn't surfaced immediately, and he began beating up on this little lady to whom he was married. Then he began chasing my mom around the house with a butcher knife. So we held a group conscience meeting. And it was decided the only thing to do with Eddie was for his little wife to take him back to Ann Arbor, Michigan, and recommit him in a mental institution, and this was done. And Bill and Dad were crestfallen. Here's their first attempt to sober up another alcoholic. Total failure. But I want to tell you folks something. At my dad's funeral 15 years later, a guy walked up to me and said, "Do you know me?" And I looked over and I said, "Yeah, I know you. You're Eddie." And he said, "That's right." And he said, "I want you to know I'm a member of the Youngstown, Ohio AA group, and I've been sober 1 year." So we don't know the result of that 12-step call. Our part is to take that hand that reaches out for help. That's our part of it. And we don't have to be fully qualified to go. We go with what we have. We go with what we have. And I know that I've made 12-step calls where the person I called on wished I wasn't there. Pretty soon I wished I wasn't there. But we don't know the outcome of it. Our part is to take that effort, reach out and get that hand. I want to tell you about my dad. I think you'd have loved the guy. All the pictures of him look so grim. Well, he wasn't that way at all. Dad was a tall, thin Vermonter from St. Johnsbury, and he was a graduate of Dartmouth, one of the Ivy League colleges, and the Drinkers Ivy League College, and he kind of fit right in there, and he went back to St. Johnsbury and prevailed upon his dad to allow him to come out to Chicago and go to medical school. Well, he busted out of the first one because of his drinking, because it's progressive like it always was. Somehow managed to stay sober long enough to graduate from the second one and moved to Akron, Ohio, because they had a coded equipment internship there. And so he moved there to Akron and married my mom after a whirlwind courtship of only 17 years. Dr. Bob thought things over very carefully. When I brought my bride to be home in the 1940s, my wife was tall and slender. Dad took a look at her and got me aside and said, "She's built for speed and light housekeeping." And I'll tell you, his section hygiene lecture to me as a teenager. He got me up in the bathroom one day, and I thought, I'm going to find out all about it now. We sat down, and he said to me, "Flies spread disease. Keep yours buttoned." He was such a good sport. He had some sort of an old car that didn't run very well. He used a lot of gasoline, and I had a Model A Ford Roadster that I had bought for less than $30. And Dad said, "You think that thing would run to Vermont and then up into Canada?" And I said, "Well, it runs great, Dad, but the reason that I got it so cheap was I didn't get the top." I said, "What are we going to do when it rains?" He said, "We're going to get wet." And he and I and a high school buddy of mine, we toured all through New England and Canada with that old Ford Roadster. Just had a wonderful time. He was a good sport guy, and you'd have loved him. Loved jokes. Bill, also was a tall, thin Vermonter. They were born within 100 miles of each other. Bill at East Dorset, my dad at St. Johnsbury. But they were total opposites. Total opposites. Bill was garrulous. Bill was a talker. Bill was a visitor. Bill was a promoter. Bill was a visionary. I think Bill Wilson was could see further up the road than any human I've ever known in my life. He was that kind of fellow. His mood swung. He was either high as a Georgia pine or low as a snake, you know. And Bill went into long periods of depression, one time 2 or 3 years. But my dad didn't do that. He went along on pretty much of an even keel all the time, and he served as kind of a balance wheel for Bill. And Dad was good at 12-step work. You know, he only lived 15 years, and some of you here have more sobriety than my dad. But in that length of time, he personally treated over 5,000 alcoholics, AA and medically, without charge. So I like to think of Dr. Bob as Mr. 12-step. But I told you these were just exact opposites. They never had an argument, though. They just never had an argument. They fit together perfectly. And I think, again, that was providentially arranged because, you see, if any two of us are exactly alike, one of us is unnecessary. Now, hospital beds were very expensive in those days. A double was $16. I think they're up a little now, but nobody had any money, so they got the idea about treating alcoholics into our home. And, well, first of all, let me say this to you. The first 17 years of my life, I was raised in a home with active alcoholism, so I do understand that. Were any of you in here raised in a home with active alcoholism? Raise your hand. Oh, wow. Let me talk about that just briefly, if I may. I don't doubt what we get to maturity with scars. I don't doubt that for a minute. I also know that each of us developed our own way to cope with that problem. Because I know that you don't ever bring anybody home. I know these things. What I did was I was a runner. I got out of that house and I stayed as long as I could without getting in serious trouble with my parents. That was my method of coping. And I speak only for myself, but I got to say the one thing that I must be on the alert for and guard against is not to adopt a victim mindset. You know, all the things that I did that I shouldn't have done, all the things that I shouldn't have done and did, they're not my fault. I'm raised in a home with active alcoholism. I'm a victim of someone else's alcoholism. Well, folks, this works. This works beautifully, but there's a price right up front that I have to pay for that. And that price is right where you can see it. You have to increasingly resent a person or a group of persons or an event in order to keep that victim mindset going. And you know, one thing we learned in our programs, the one thing that will totally destroy us is resentments. Totally destroy us. And our programs teach us how to not, at least in my case, not resent it. I think of myself as a survivor. I'm not a victim, I'm a survivor. And thank God we have direction in our program how we can do this. Well, at first it was just a trickle. Now, my sister and I were both high school kids, and they were treating these alcoholics in our home. They had a standard treatment. They brought a new guy in, and we'd take him upstairs. And my dad knocked him out from 24 to 36 hours with a sedative called formaldehyde. Not formaldehyde, folks. Formaldehyde. And when the guy came to, they'd bring him downstairs, and they had a diet that they'd worked out. And this is what it was. It was canned tomatoes, sauerkraut. Yeah, Bill had an ulcer, and he thought sauerkraut cured everything. And Karo syrup. I think you'll agree the early alcoholics were a hardy group. But when my sister and I came home, if we opened the front door and smelled formaldehyde, we knew we'd lost our bed. But we didn't mind. This was recovery. This was recovery, and we were teenagers. And you know how teenagers love action. And you can imagine with a house full of wet drunks, there was lots of action. They were squirting out in every direction, you know. And they weren't just overnight guests. Arch T went and started AA in Detroit, stayed almost a year. That's how sick Arch was. But anyway, this was a beautiful time in our life. We saw recovery. But it was just a trickle. Just a few people coming in. And right now I want to stop and I want to tell you about somebody that nobody knows anything about, and I think maybe she wanted it that way, and that's my mom. Remember, Mom was the one that invited Bill. Mom also invited Lois, our beloved Avalon co-founder, to come that first summer and visit with us, and Lois did. Stayed as long as she could. You remember Lois had to get back to New York, though Lois was the only one that had a job. But that started a friendship that lasted until Lois died, and then not too far distant past. But Mom was the one that was cooking the food. Mom was the one that was making the beds. And Mom was the one that was answering the phone because they began getting some inquiries about this. And Mom was the one that endured the snugs because AA was not an instant success. It was thought as a cult and a bunch of nuts. Mom was the one that endured the stuff. We even got kicked out of the Presbyterian Church on account of AA. And I never heard of anybody getting kicked out of the Presbyterian Church, but we did. Mom was the one that insisted that everyone stay there, have a quiet time in the morning, that they might feel near to God. And in the early part of 1936, Mom organized a group for the wives of alcoholics and sweethearts, whereby she tried to teach them love and tolerance in her way. And you know, when Lois and Ann B., not my mom, but Ann B., decided to see if there was any interest in the Al-Anon program, they wrote to all the known AA groups around the country, and to their surprise, they found out there were 64 groups already doing it. Independent thinking had decided it was an illness that affected the whole family, and they were doing something about it. Mom took up smoking when she was 50. I said, Mom, you're not going to start smoking now, are you? And she said, if you wait till you're 50, I won't say anything. Well, my sister and I were swiping Mom's cigarettes, and Mom decided as an economy measure she would start making her own cigarettes. And she bought a machine called a Target machine. Did any of you ever see a Target machine? It's a little mechanical device. You lay the paper in a trough and you sprinkle the tobacco in, and it had a lever, and you roll it over the back and you had a cigarette. So we thought that those were a little bit beneath our dignity, so we volunteered to help her. And instead of using tobacco, we used shavings out of the pencil sharpener. Well, when she lit the first one, of course, the fire didn't go out. After 2 or 3 of these, she said, you know, these aren't nearly as good as those Lucky Strikes. All the early meetings were open meetings, and Mom always sat at the very back, right by the door, and greeted everyone that came in. Always, the only decent dress she had was an old black dress, and she wore it every time they had a meeting. And when my dad got back on his feet financially, Mom got 3 new dresses, and somebody said, Ann, you going to wear one of your new dresses to the meeting tonight? And she said, oh, no, I'm going to wear the old black dress. There'll be somebody come through those doors that can't afford a new dress. And that was my mom, this beautiful person. You know, Bill wanted her to write the chapter to the wives and the family afterward, and she wouldn't do it. And I don't know why, but she just wouldn't do it. So he wrote them himself. Made Lois mad. But even though you're a co-founder, you're not completely well, you know. And the only alibi he could think of is that I didn't want to spoil the continuity of the book. That was all he could come up with. Well, when the media got a hold of this fledgling movement, the trickle became an absolute deluge. And the word got around that there was a doctor in Akron, Ohio, could quote fix drunks. And they came in on the bus, on the train, dropped off by loving relatives. Dropped off by relatives who weren't so loving. And again, our Heavenly Father provided the right person at the right time. Sister Ignatia was the admitting nurse at a Catholic hospital there in Akron, and she and my dad prevailed upon the Mother Superior to allow them to start an alcoholic ward whereby people could be admitted with the disease of alcoholism for the first time. Now, this little room was a very small room. It was a flower room, cots in it. And in those days, the nurses had to bring all the flowers for the patient's room back and put them in storage at night because of the oxygen or whatever it is that the flowers used up. And I've often wondered when those early alcoholics came to and looked around and there's nothing but flowers. But anyway, it continued to grow. And AA started to self-destruct between 1942 and 45. What happened was a lot of the guys were gone to war, and the other people were taking AA, and they were using it for their own benefit. There were people that started treatment centers, the official AA treatment center. There were people hanging out their shingle as AA's official representative. They were incorporating AA in different states as their own corporation idea. And a guy wrote to Bill from North Carolina and said, Bill, we got to do something. We're going to be like the Washingtonians. Well, some of you know that have studied history that the Washingtonians was a group of 6 alcoholics from Baltimore, decided they wanted to stay sober. And they started an organization called the Washingtonians. They had the idea of total abstinence. They had meetings. They traveled to each other's meetings, and they grew 10 times faster than AA ever grew. It was. I've got a book that showed that the Washingtonians had 250,000 people in Ohio alone. But what happened was the Washingtonians decided that if it was good for alcoholism, it was good for everything. They got into politics. They got into money. They got into issues that were of contention of the time. And anyway, what the result of it was, they just split apart, just blew apart. And in a few years, they were totally gone. And I'll tell you how far gone they were. Bill had to go to the public library there in New York City to see who the Washingtonians were. So, the 12 traditions were written, and I'm so glad you read them. They're the glue that holds us together, folks. See, Bill went around the country trying to get groups interested in adopting the 12 traditions, and groups were then like they are now. They said, Bill, go on back to New York and run that like we want to. We'll run this like we want to. And they didn't pay any attention to him. So at the first international in 1950, and I was there, 6 guys got up and each of them read 2 of the traditions. And they adopted them unanimously. And oh, what a blessing that is. Have you ever looked at those traditions carefully? You know what they are? Damage control. Really. Anticipating some of the things that might have just totally destroyed the movement. How about this one? We're self-supporting through our own contribution. In the early days, the liquor industry wanted to give AA big money. You know, as a publicity thing, because an alcoholic laying in the street wasn't very good advertising for the whiskey business. Somehow they managed to turn it down, even though they didn't have any money. And think, you know, if they'd taken that money, there'd have been some strings attached to it. And we can't have that. And other things could have given AA stuff, but there would be strings attached. And somehow, through a little miracle, they've refused that money. And that's just one of the many, many blessings that have come our way. Well, My dad was terminally ill. Mom had died the year before, and Dad was terminally ill. He was dying, and he gave a short talk there at Cleveland at that first international. And then my wife and I drove him back to his beloved Vermont one more time. And I wouldn't take for the time that we had as we drove along, carrying and sharing and sitting on the edge of the bed at night and talking to this sweetheart of a guy. But I had a flying job out of Dallas at the time, and I had to get back to work, and I never saw my dad alive again. But oh, what a treasure time that was for me. And Bill invited us to the second international, and that was in 55 in St. Louis. And this is the international where the spiritual people who loved AA when AA wasn't cool, got up and gave talks. Dr. Sam Shoemaker from New York and Father Ed Dowling from St. Louis gave talks, and those talks are recorded. They're in the book AA Comes of Age. The chapter of religion looks at AA, if any of you care to read it. They're there word for word. Sister Ignatia gave a little talk there. But the important part was Bill turned AA over to the AAs. This was the time when he turned control of this thing over to the central office structure, the trustee structure. And that has been one of the things that has saved AA, has kept it alive. You know, I've read about earlier attempts, and one of the things that always seemed to happen was the founder either died or moved away and the thing just fell. But you see, now he had made provision for it to go. He figured the founders were immortal, and they made provisions for that. My wife and I were party animals. We loved to dance and we loved to drink. And we went merrily on our way, and I wasn't telling anybody my father was Dr. Bob Schmidt. But once in a while somebody would find it out and invite us to a meeting. And we would go, and on the way home we'd say, oh, good for them. They needed that. And all the while alcoholism was working in our family. Betty had poured her dad into a dry and out place in Denver in the 1940s, and he, another guy, started AA in the state of New Mexico. So if there was ever two human beings that should have recognized alcoholism, it was my wife and me. But we didn't. You see, we thought we were different. Did any of you ever think you were different? And alcoholism with us, you know, there was three parts: fun, and problems. Problems. We're way into the problem area by then. And I'll tell you how bad it got. My mother-in-law said, tell her you want a divorce. That'll shock her. And I did. And I was so disappointed in the results. It didn't upset her near as much as I thought it would. But you see, you got to remember that the disease becomes the number one priority, and the family moves down the line. It's just the nature of the illness. It becomes the number one priority. Well, Betty went on. Well, we didn't immediately jump into AA. I got to tell you this. You know, we didn't say, oh, hot dog, we're going to recognize the goal of our lifetime. We've always wanted to do this. And we began trying to touch things up and keep on going like to do it. I like to tell a little story, I think, that illustrates that two hunters loved to hunt way up in the north woods of Alaska, and they'd hire a little aviation company to come in, land them on a lake, and leave them and come back in a week and pick them up. So the plane came in, and one of the hunters said, oh, we are so glad to see you. We've had a wonderful hunt. We've got 3 moose. And the pilot said, you 2 guys, me, and 3 moose in this little airplane? No, I don't think so. Well, the hunter said, don't worry about it. The guy came in with a plane exactly like yours last year, and we had 3 moose. And what he did was he taxied up the river and got a longer takeoff run on the lake, and we didn't have any trouble getting going. So the pilot thought, well, I'm pretty new with the company. I guess I got to try this. So he did, and sure enough, the plane takes off, and they start heading back towards civilization. But the little engine's working so hard it begins to overheat. It loses power, and way out in the middle of nothing, the plane crashes. Well, one of the hunters drags his buddy out from under the plane and dusts him off, and his buddy looked around and said, "Oh, where in the world are we?" The other said, "I think we're within 100 yards of where we crashed last year." And that was us. Trying the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Well, when it finally got bad enough, as happens, a young pharmacist called up my wife and said, "Betty, we're starting an AA group here in Nocona, Texas, for people that have a problem like you and me. Will you come?" And she said yes. And she came and she quit. She didn't go to a treatment center. She quit hanging on by her fingernails, and she said, "I don't recommend you do it that way, but I'll tell you one thing, you darn sure won't forget it." And never took another drink. Well, she was running off and leaving me. Really, it was a program of attraction with me. She was learning new stuff. She was working it as hard as she could, and she was leaving me in the dust. And someone said, "Well, Bob, why don't you join Al-Anon?" I thought, well, why not? I don't mind joining the auxiliary. So I got in my car, and I drove over to Gainesville, Texas, 40 miles to the east, and I walked into my first Al-Anon meeting, and I look around, I'm the only guy. Room full of women. And I immediately got mixed emotions about Al-Anon. Let me describe mixed emotions this way. It's kind of like the feeling you get when your teenage daughter comes at 4 in the morning with a big gritty Bible on her arm. But anyway, I stayed, and I laid a trip on those gals. And I thought, I left there knowing I'd done a wonderful job. The rock that had been holding the family together. Noble, bloody but unbound. But these things are revealed to us, I think, as we can handle them. I talked to Ann, one of the ladies that was there a few years later, and she said, "Oh, I remember that meeting, Bob." I said, "After you left, we held a meeting." It said, "There's one that's not going to make it." Did you ever wonder where they got the ideas for these programs? Bill in New York City for 6 months, and my dad and mother in Akron, Ohio for 2.5 years belonged to an organization called the Oxford Group. Now, the Oxford Group was started by a Lutheran minister from Pennsylvania by the name of Frank Buckman. And the basic tenets of the Oxford Group were back to first century spirituality. They had meetings. They shared with each other. They had a form of a fifth step, and they had the four absolute honesty, absolute unselfishness, absolute purity of thought, and absolute love that have been woven into our programs. I used to go to some of those meetings with my parents, and they scared me. They were such zealots, in your face. Are you maximum today? I was just barely minimum, And you see, it was inevitable that they part, because I think anybody that gets to the AA program is not absolutely absolute about anything. And they had their absolutes. Also, the Oxford Group catered to the upper middle class, and the early alcoholics were not upper middle class. And also, the Oxford Group wanted publicity. and the alcoholics already had all the publicity they wanted. And they had a form of a fifth step. They'd take a new guy upstairs in one of the bedrooms at T. Henry Williams' home where they held us, and they would bore in on him till he admitted what his problem was. And I think they must have really worked him over. But anyway, this was a form of open confession, and was not acceptable to people of the Catholic religion. And I don't know if you realize it or not, but there are a few Catholics that drink too much. So it was inevitable that we part, but we owe these people a tremendous debt of gratitude. Thank you. It's water. Also, God has his own big book. And the things that they used and found helpful were from the Holy Bible, the Sermon on the Mount, the 13th Corinthians, and the book of James, which, as you all know, is faith without works is dead. These were the background materials that they used to feed into and consolidate the program. We had a lot of anger in our recovery. I don't know about you, but both ways. And we had to work through that. And I had to work with it in a relationship. It doesn't have to be 50-50. Sometimes it's 90-10. Sometimes it's 10-90. And what's the difference? It'll all even out. I had to learn those things. I had to learn to peel away the past, and the past dies very, very slowly. But so many beautiful blessings have occurred since I've been studying and trying to learn. Honesty. I think I was always what I call cash register honest. If the girl gave me too much change, I'd say, "Here, honey, you gave me a quarter too much," and just feel so honest all day long. And then there's another stage of honesty with me, and I call that resume honesty. I basically tell you the truth, but I gussy it up so I'll look good. And then there's the total honesty that we learn in our program, that when I can show you me just like I am, warts and all, and you do the same for me, we can have an instant, intimate relationship. And I know of no other organization in the world that we can do this. Beautiful blessing of the program. God. I was raised in the Episcopal Church. That's Catholic light. All the pageantry without the guilt. Yeah. But God was used to improve my deportment. And, if you do this, he's going to get you. Well, I didn't like that as much as an adult. So pretty soon I passed that one by. In World War II, I was a bomber pilot and flight commander, and I flew 45 missions out of Africa, the old 4-engine Liberator. And our losses were very, very heavy. And I had a relationship with God I call a 911 relationship. I made deals with God. Did any of you ever do that? Make deals with God? God, if you'll get me out of this mess, I swear. Well, that isn't a very good relationship either. Hi, buddy. You blew somebody? There you go. But now the relationship that I have with God these days as a result of my program, God is my Heavenly Father. We're all God's kids. We are all God's kids. And that helps me when I look at some people. Really? But that's true. We're all God's kids, and I talk to my God just like I can talk to you. I pray to him, I thank him every night, and I pray to him every day, and I pray for things that will help other people. And I talk to him even as we're driving along the highway, and perhaps you do too. You're like, God, did you see that SOB cut us off? But it's a beautiful relationship, and the more I am open with him, the more he reveals himself to me. And that is another beautiful, beautiful blessing of the program. Freedom. You know, I think when we get here, we have a freedom. Do any of you remember the old country and western song, Me and Bobby McGee? Yeah. Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. Nothing ain't worth nothing, but it's free. That's kind of how it is when we get here. Then as we begin to work the program and we come to that turning point with me, it's, am I going to work this program or am I not? Am I going to turn my will and my life over to care of God as I understanding, or am I not? And this gives me a freedom for the first time. The alcoholic is free, unshackled from the bottle, and the Al-Anon is unshackled from the alcoholic. We have freedom of choice for the first time. We can make good choices, we can make bad choices, but we have freedom of choice. And then my sponsor has told me about another freedom. He said, try this, Bob. He said, when you get up in the morning, say, okay, God, you're the in-house manager. You're running it. Let him do the thinking, you do the legwork. And that's another level of freedom. That's as high as I've gotten. Well, the miracles have kept coming. And so many of them. Did you ever stop and think about some of these that have happened? How about this one? Bill and Dad were broke, and they were human beings, and they thought, boy, wouldn't it be great if we had some money for this wonderful thing we got going. My dad could see himself with the treatment center, you know, with his white coat on, greeting the patients, and maybe Bill out on the streets flagging them in, you know. So they went to New York and met with people with deep, deep pockets to get some money for this. And Mr. Rockefeller and his group listened very intently and said, no, money will ruin it. That's a miracle, folks. Now just think in your own mind what might have happened if Mr. Rockefeller and his group had dumped $1 million on 100 broke alcoholics. It's just horrible to even think about it. Miracle. Anonymity. In the early days of Alcohol Anonymous and Al-Anon, there were people with huge egos. Now, I know we don't have any of that anymore. But you can't be Mr. AA or Mrs. Al-Anon if nobody knows what your name is. And another thing that has done, folks, it makes no difference if you've been here 40 days or 40 years, we're all exactly the same. And isn't that the way it should be? And that's a miracle. God, as we understood him, was put in there to quiet a loudmouth agnostic by the name of Jimmy B. Jimmy said, this God stuff will ruin it. He said, it'll run them out a bit faster than we can drag them in. So to shut Jimmy up, they put God as we understood him. And what that has done, that has made these programs acceptable to religions all over the world. People who have an entirely different concept of our perhaps you and me. Just those words made it acceptable. That has to be a miracle. The big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, you know, when they wrote it first, they couldn't give it away. It was in a bonded warehouse, and the guy wouldn't let them have any books until they came with the dough. So they raised a little money, go buy what they could, sell them, and they gave them a little extra money, and they'd get a few more the next time. And that's the way it was. Very, very slow. Now I understand, folks, it's the number 2 seller at all times, just behind the Holy Bible. And I don't know how it is here, but in Texas you can't even buy one in a bookstore that I know of. You have to go through central office or an AA group. All in my lifetime. And the first 164 pages are exactly the same of the text except for one word. Bill had had a spiritual experience. It came on him as a bunch of huge light and came on him almost instantly. Most of us don't get it that way. Most of us have to work at it, and it's a gradual thing to build up. So they changed that word from having had a spiritual experience to having had a spiritual what? Awakening. And that's the only change. And think of the millions and millions of alcoholics that have tried to find a loophole in those first 160 pages. Somehow they covered them all. The programs are just full of miracles. So if you're new here and your life is just starting again, or you've relapsed and you're back down in the pits again, you're starting from nothing, just remember, so do these programs. So do these programs. And if you're in bad need of a miracle, look around here. Everyone in this room is a miracle. And we want to talk to you. You don't bother us, you help us. You strengthen us. Stay with us. Hang in there with us. You see, I don't know if you're new here, if you can understand that when we can help you, that's the source of our happiness. Let me quote for you Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who was a humanist of my generation. Dr. Schweitzer was a world-class organist, and he went back and became a medical doctor and went down into darkest Africa and started hospitals and did nothing but treat people who had never seen a doctor for the balance of his life. And Dr. Schweitzer said, I know not what your destiny may be, but this one thing I do know, that those among you who will find true happiness are those who have sought and found how to serve. And isn't that what we're doing here? And isn't that the source of our happiness? So if you're new here, just remember, we want to help you. Just remember, every one of us was brand new at one time or another. And just remember, it's the source of our happiness. So hang in there with us. Stick with the winners. Stick with the winners, and you will surely be with us as we trudge that road to happy destiny. I got one more thing I want to tell you, then I'm going to quit. You know, my wife died 4 years ago, and I've been a lonely old guy since. Well, I found a lady. And we've been married about a month and a half. She's 26 years sober in And you know how us Al-Anons, we can spot an alcoholic at 100 yards. And of course, she's got a few rough edges, around the edges, but nothing that the love of a good Al-Anon can't fix. So anyhow, folks, my God never closes one door but what he doesn't open another one. And I'm sure your God will do the same. Thank you very much.
Before we do some more announcements, the committee, Bob, wanted to give you something as a token of our appreciation for speaking tonight. Okay, and Susie C. Will close the meeting with a brief announcements followed by reading of the promises in the Serenity Prayer, which is a surprise to Susie at the moment. So. Sorry, honey, I forgot to tell you.
Where do I start?
Right here, just read all that.
Thank you. My name is Susie C. I'm an alcoholic. Announcements. The registration table will be open for 30 minutes after tonight's speaker meeting for those who have not yet had an opportunity to register. We are also offering a significant discount for those who would like to pre-register for next year's conference. If you register for next year before noon on Sunday, the registration is only $15. Workshops begin tomorrow morning at 8:30. We have a variety of great topics scheduled, so make the most of the conference by attending as many as you can. You'll find a list of those in your packet. Our hospitality room and our quiet room will also be available tomorrow from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. Tomorrow night's speaker meeting will begin at 8 p.m. with our Al-Anon speaker, Judy C. of Roseville, followed by the sobriety countdown, and then our AA speaker, Starkey of Dallas, Texas. Is that it? That's it. Thank you.
Yes, and now we're going to read the promises, and Theodora is going to read the promises for us.
Hi, my name is Theodora, and I'm a grateful alcoholic and an addict. The promises. If we are painstaking about the phase of our development, we will be amazed before we are halfway through. We're going to know a new freedom and a new happiness. We will not regret the past, nor wish to shut the door on it. We will comprehend the word serenity, and we will know peace. No matter how far down the scale we have gone, we will see how our experience can benefit others. That feeling of uselessness and self-pity will disappear. We will lose interest in selfish things and gain interest in our fellows. Self-seeking will slip away. Our whole attitude and outlook upon life will change. Fear of people and of economic will suddenly realize that God is doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. Are these extravagant promises? We think not. They are being fulfilled among us, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. They will always materialize if we work for them.